So, building on Friday's exploration of agricultural expansion and practice in the Central Middle Ages, I start today with consideration of strategies to sustain and extend farming across the extremes of the Little Ice Age from the 15th to 18th centuries. New methods were not always beneficial in the longer term. Some practices led to catastrophic loss in times of greater climatic instability, as occurred in the later 16th and 17th centuries. But technological conservatism in the face of changing weather and soil conditions, or adherence to exploitation methods that had developed in better times, risked new precarity for agricultural communities already teetering on the brink of unsustainability. Rather than the era falling into conventional pre-improvement and improvement phases, with the former characterized as wedded to inefficient practices and locked into a spiral of irretrievable decline, and the latter trumpeted as an era of discovery and revolutionary transformation, however, we will see that experimentation, innovation, and adaptation were present across these 400 years, operating in parallel with attempted continuity of traditional methods. So, let us begin by considering the effects of climatic instability on Scottish social structures and relationships as the Little Ice Age became established. Amongst James I's parliamentary acts from 1525 was one designed to stop profiteering through inflated food prices. Lying amidst other acts to regulate and stimulate international trade, this act had fundamental issues of supply behind it. Repeated efforts to encourage grain imports, coupled with legislation from 1426 requiring landowners to sow wheat, peas and beans or face heavy fines, expose perceptions of persistent shortages of basic foodstuffs, regardless of much reduced population levels post-Black Death. One remedy for this was seen in re-expansion of cultivation. Here, we see a standard response to shortfalls in yields, the breaking of new ground simply to grow more, or intensified cropping of land previously only sown intermittently. Grain prices are a proxy for yield volume and quality, but are blunt instruments given the patchy regional survival of data. Upward trends in the later 14th and early 15th centuries, however, provide context for the 1426 Act. By the 1430s, however, extreme weather events accompanying the then current climate shift had wiped out gains from that legislation. Indeed, high prices, up to 108 pence per ball for wheat in Aberdeen in 1438, against an average below 50 pence per ball in the 1400 to 1424 period, evidences a short-term subsistence crisis and confirms chronicle accounts of harvest failures and famines in the late 1430s. But, although they brought death and suffering, these episodes were short and prices reverted quickly to previous levels. 1438's highs were not surpassed until the 1450s, another decade of acute shortage and widespread social disorder. Rather than continuous crisis, therefore, we see a rising trend of socioeconomic distress from the 1420s, punctuated by more acute episodes. One symptom of this distress were the numbers of able-bodied beggars, suggestive of men failing to subsist lawfully on society's margins. Many were peasant farmers who became dislocated economic migrants. Insecurity of tenure worsened in times of subsistence crisis, and legislation in 1450 tried to give greater security to the poor people that laboured the ground. This act aimed to stop men falling into beggary, adding to the landless drifters whose very existence alarmed Parliament. Indeed, its pairing with a law against sorners, overliers, masterful beggars, etc., which empowered draconian action against such men, reveals belief that these groups posed real and growing threats to social order. Sorning, the forceful imposition of yourself on another for your food and shelter, was a form of predatory behaviour that increased sharply at this time. Further action against vagrancy occurred after poor harvests and political turbulence in the 1452 to 55 period, when economic necessity and the socio-political fallout from the fall of the Black Douglases displaced more vulnerable people. That similar legislation was repeated in 1478 amid successive poor harvests confirms that much of this vagrancy arose from those at society's economic margins slipping over the edge. Tensions arising from poor yields and landlord demands are illustrated by a court action at Perth in February 1457, to which this picture belongs rather than the previous one. The complainant was the abbot of Scone, who alleged that wheat renders due from Inchmartian in the Carse of Gowrie had, quote, not been paid of sufficient wheat, but of tares, impurities, and other useless seeds, end quote, and exhibited a sample of what had been rendered. The impurities were perhaps field or corn marigold, the Glebionis segatum, an invasive species and widespread agricultural pest which tenants were required to clear from their fields. From 1468, Cooper-Angus Abbey's leases obliged tenants to eradicate guld, as corn marigold was named in Scots. A surviving section of one contemporary law code contains two clauses relating to guld. The first, warning that tenants who allowed the plant to flourish should be punished as if they had led enemies into the kingdom, and the second, setting a fine for every guld plant of one butchered sheep. At Cooper-Angus, men whose land was foul, as the term was, with guld, were fined heavily and forced to clear their fields 3 times annually thereafter. Whether delivery of contaminated grain to Scone was sharp practice on the tenants' part, perhaps to capitalise on selling their better quality wheat during a time of supply-driven inflation, or an act of desperation by men with insufficient foodstuffs on which to subsist, this case highlights deficiencies in yields even in the best arable areas. Expansion of cultivation was a common response to falling yields. It means a SART, a process reflected in growing complaints of unlicensed breaking of land and its ploughing and sowing by outsiders. In the Cheviots, local use of the widespread medieval practice of enclosing sheep and cattle at night on the outfield, or tathing, concentrated their dung and urine on patches of grazing. This created areas of fertilised ground that was cultivated for a time, then let revert to grass. Such practices probably underlie the high-altitude cultivation identified by research and survey at Beaumont and South Dean. What the Beaumont evidence does not tell us, however, is if this was continuous or short and discontinuous exploitation of ground temporarily enriched through tathing. What it also does not tell us is how productive this upland cultivation was, and did yield levels justify the energy devoted to their production. If the continued investment in their cultivation and the pressure to extend them later in the 15th and 16th century is a measure of this, the answer is clearly yes. Oats and beer will grow in poor weather conditions and at altitude, although the shorter growing season limits grain development and ripening and raises questions of yield volume and quality. Our record data includes multiple examples of how poorer weather accelerated deterioration of soil conditions. Many reveal an interplay of weather and farming practice which brought episodes of erosion. In coastal districts, storm surge and sea flood were hardly new experiences, but after 1500 they proliferated, often linked to specific extreme events. Much evidence relates to districts most exposed to Atlantic storms in the Northern and Western Isles, but significant events struck districts in the South and East mainland. Amongst the worst affected areas was Orkney, where Atlantic storms wrought wind erosion of arable land, first recorded in the 1480s, but unabated in the 1500s. Rentals from Westray here for 1500 to 1508 coincide with a long episode of poor weather and record expanses of arable on sandy soils at Rackwick as blown away by the wind, while arable and lynx grazing on Papa Westray were noted as overblown with water and sand. Overblown with water and sand, as a result of dune deflation and wind-driven waves. Farms on Sandy were likewise blown, many lying unoccupied due to their unproductive condition. Similar trends occurred in the Western Isles, where increasingly frequent and intense storms from the 1420s marked the start of a long process with peaks of arable loss in the early 16th and 17th century. The sandy barrier islands and Machair down the exposed Atlantic-facing coast of the Uists saw accelerating erosion after 1450, worsening in the early 1500s and reaching extremes in the solar minima of the 17th century. By the early 1540s, North Uist had already lost 2 merklands of the 60 at which the island was valued. This land, described, quote, as lying destroyed through the flowing of the sea, lay on the west side Machair. Further erosion episodes struck in the early 1600s where, quote, the oldest men report this isle to be much impaired and destroyed by the sands overblowing and burying habitable lands, and the sea hath followed and made the loss irreparable. At the Udall in North Uist, it was appalling weather in the 1690s, culminating in a great gale in 1697 that ended occupation at this formerly high-status settlement beneath 6 metres of windblown sand. Westerly gales also brought losses on coastal agricultural land on the mainland. In East Lothian, Aberlady Bay's dune systems had been destabilised through agricultural encroachment, the stripping of turf and bent for domestic needs, and extensive rabbit burrowing. A 1627 report on the parish of Dirrelton noted that the minister's glebe in adjacent Gillan parish was, quote, so overblown with sand as the largest acre thereof has not been manured these 5 years bygone, end quote, and that its current value would fall further as the Samen is likely to be overblown more with sand. The same report listed 7 husbandlands in Eldbottle, a settlement in the dunes northwest of Dirrelton, 3 of them and 6 further acres of arable being, quote, 2-part waste, being overblown with sand, end quote. Before the end of the century, Eldbottle was almost abandoned. In the 1690s, at Culbin on the Murray coast west of Findhorn Bay, despite long-held traditions of a single catastrophic event overwhelming a prosperous arable estate, sand inundation was a protracted process across decades. Again, progressive sand encroachment has long been a problem, but accelerated with the prevailing strong westerlies finally to defeat the efforts of Culbin's occupants to hold it back. In both cases, the common denominator was a disastrous interplay of human and environmental factors, where human exploitation of dune material damaged the root systems that stabilized the sand and created weaknesses in the mat that were exposed to devastating effect in the stormier conditions of the late 1600s. Windblown sand was not the only threat to coastal zones. Inundation of low-lying districts by storm surges, driven by stronger winds, become more frequent. The sea retook areas of drained former wetland, eroding sandy zones like the Outer Hebridean Machair or lowland saltgrass grazing, and resalting estuarine flats that had been taken into cultivation in previous centuries. On the mainland, the most visible inroads were in the karsts of the Forth, around the Lake of Murray and the rivers that fed into the Solway Firth. On the inner Forth estuary, between Grangemouth and Airth, karstland drained and settled in the 13th century lay abandoned by the 1530s, quote, since a great part of the lands are submerged daily by inundation of the sea and the rivers known as Carron and Forth. Here, the risk intensified with spate floods from increased rainfall and snowmelt in the first quarter of the century, especially when such conditions coincided with high tides and storm surges. On the opposite side of the Forth at Ferryton in Clackmannanshire, severe weather in late 1636 caused the breaching of dykes that protected low-lying arable on the Carse. The following year, the 3rd Earl of Lothian wrote that, quote, there hath been such inundations, floods, and winds as no man living remembers the like, end quote. Losses of coastal arable and grazing land in the later 17th century increased competition for remaining resources and fueled litigation where competition spilled over into conflict. The greater survival of court records from this period skews the picture through the higher volume of cases involving such clashes within them. But it is also a symptom of mounting pressure on populations from the deteriorating weather. In some cases, the link to weather was explicit. In 1687, here at Boromos, on the Cree estuary north of Wigtown, the Earl of Galloway's tenants were accused of removing dikes around their arable and extending cultivation into areas where Wigtown's burgesses secured turf and peat for building, roofing, fuel and garden soil deepening. Wigtown's council took court action to remove the transgressors, but the Earl claimed in their defence that the encroachment was forced by losses to the sea of the land upon which they had subsisted. If true, his claim points to extensive flooding on the west side of Wigtown Bay during the stormier periods of the Maunder Minimum. The Boromos case also records the alternative use of the contested land as a source of fertilisers for the Burgesses' field, continuing an exploitative practice that had evolved in times of more benign weather. Soil enrichment occurred across good years and bad, but particular efforts were made in times of declining yields to enhance productivity. Around urban communities and in the kale yards associated with rural housing, extensive areas of anthrasols, where the soil has been deepened and fertilised with a range of household midden and latrine waste, street sweepings, byre waste, animal slaughter, fish processing and industrial byproducts, turf, old roofing thatch and the like, document centuries of efforts to good the land. Outcomes, however, were not always positive, for much of the erosion and sandblow in Orkney and around the mainland coastline was worsened by traditions of turf stripping from sandy links to provide organic materials to dig into cultivated ground as soil enrichers. Here at Marwick in Orkney mainland, it is estimated that nearly 200,000 cubic metres of grassy turf and topsoil, that's around about 280,000 metric tons, was stripped between the 12th and 19th centuries, transported 5 kilometres and mixed with animal manure and seaware to be added in the cultivated ground of nearby farms. This process devastated the upland, leaving an ecologically impoverished zone like the second picture there at Dearness, on nutrient-poor subsoils exposed by removal of surface layers. Now, in Orkney, analysis of soil content and structure in the arable zone at Marwick reveals that its cultivation intensified in the early post-medieval period. Along with the technological innovations in plough, harrow and harness types adopted in the islands at this time, this intensification is indicative of the Orcadian response to climatic deterioration and environmental degradation. It was a response replicated in urban and rural contexts across mainland Scotland, where research into manuring practices has revealed that turf stripped from nearby grassland provided the bulk of anthracol-forming materials. Soil profiles from Wigtown, Lauder, Pittenweem, St Andrews and Nairn bear striking similarities to those from Marwick and show that the greatest effort focused on private gardens and fields rather than areas of common cultivation. They are also testimony to the vast quantities of turf and topsoil removed through processes that effectively flayed the borough's hinterlands in a major example of anthropogenic environmental transformation. In Aberdeenshire in 1685, landowners collaborated to secure an Act of Parliament designed to halt such traditional methods, prohibiting, quote, the delving, tilling and casting up, end quote, of turf to make manure, but which they recognised as destructive to grassland and meadow. Despite that act, however, turf stripping was still noted by travellers 3/4 of a century later. In Murray, where overzealous turf stripping from coastal dunes at Culbin had had cataclysmic consequences, the English traveller Sir William Burrell noted in 1758 that the land was largely still arable, with scarcely any pasture to be seen. Here he observed what he identified as large commons that could have provided extensive pasture for sheep flocks, but everywhere these had been scalped of turf. By this practice, he commented dryly, quote, these wastelands are entirely bereaved of the green sward. It was, however, this disastrous interplay of human cultural practice and climate change in the depth of the Little Ice Age that stimulated a second piece of legislation to halt avoidable damage through removal of dune-stabilising scrub in the 1695 Act for Preservation of Meadows, Lands and Pasturages lying adjacent to sandhills. The law had responded, but local practice was disinclined to recognise the new legislation. There is scant evidence for action against anyone who broke its provisions. Turf stripping was not ubiquitous in coastal districts, nor was it the sole source of organic material for agricultural fertilizer. In some coastal locations, soil profiles reveal substantial inputs of shell sand and seaware. The latter, fresh or partly rotted, wave-dislodged seaweed fronds washed up on beaches, has not been identified in Neolithic to later Iron Age anthrosols. Its use commenced in the Middle Ages and continued as a form of soil enrichment into the 20th century. We have evidence for its use by the 15th century on the Archbishop of St Andrews lands in Fife, in a deed confirming rights enjoyed from at least 1440. That date correlates with the possibility that greater availability due to the stormier conditions of the Spurrer minimum had made seaware an economic asset whose ownership needed to be established. Indeed, the frequency with which it was included in charters from the 1540s onwards points to its emergence as a valuable in-demand commodity. Recognised as particularly effective for increasing the fertility and water retention of sandy soils beyond even good quality farmyard manures due to its high potassium content and organic material richness, its lack of calcium carbonate and phosphates needed admixture with other materials to avoid chemical imbalances in the soil, which they didn't understand, but we now know what was going on. Nevertheless, the remarkable bounce given to yields from seaware-enriched ground ensured that its application was regular and at volume. Importantly, if its use to enrich soils relates to its abundance due to greater storminess, it also illustrates the rapidity with which coastal communities embraced new opportunities in profoundly unsettled times. Here, we see human adaptation to changing environmental conditions, with the inherent conservatism of traditional environmental knowledge being counterbalanced by resilient opportunism. Responsiveness and resilience, then, were aspects of pre-improvement agriculture as much as its supposed conservatism. Innovation and adaptation were happening long before the traditional 18th century commencement of agricultural improvement. There is little question that changes in social and legal frameworks, as much as in the physical organization of farming communities, went hand in hand with intensification of anthropogenic change at landscape scale. We can, however, easily overstate how far adoption of new tenancy arrangements, new arable technologies, or approaches to livestock management had caused widespread change before 1700. In some districts, there were appreciable switches in practice in the 1675 to 1725 period, and it is now seen that organizational changes represented by consolidated farms under long single tenancy leases prefigured and enabled the production of new agricultural practices. These came both through lease conditions, many of which prescribed crop rotations and required annual liming of fields, and as experimental introduction by tenants. We also now recognize that clearance, whereby human populations were removed in the name of increased agricultural efficiency, long represented as an almost uniquely Highland and Hebridean experience, was as characteristic of regions spread from Murray to Galloway. It started earliest in central and southern districts, as well as the northeastern lowland fringe, as lowland lairds embraced improvement principles from the 1670s. In lowland Murray, fermtunes were consolidated under single tenancy arrangements by the mid-1670s, and in central and west Aberdeenshire by the 1720s. Although the pace accelerated after 1750, the spread of improvement agriculture in the central lowlands before that date, recorded in the maps of General William Roy, indicates that enclosure, new plantations, and the attendant division of commonties, displacement of population and economic degradation from tenant to landless labourer status were already well established. What is hinted at in the maps, however, is that improvement first happened on already heavily invested in land, where gains were easiest and quickest to achieve. This created a patchwork of improvement in a sea of unimproved land. It meant that improved islands could exist remote from supposed pioneering regions of such activity, like Lothian, if a laird was an early adopter of improvement practices and had the means to implement innovations. Once these scattered blocks of better land had been improved and could demonstrate their evident success and advantage over traditional practices, the spread of new agricultural methods into less favoured lands started. It is difficult nowadays to appreciate the scale of transformation in these processes. They were the trigger of a first phase of modern depopulation of some rural districts that accelerated from the 1790s. Depopulation, however, did not mean abandonment. It more often signalled intensification of exploitation, but with production for the market rather than subsistence being the driver. They also signalled a transition from a landscape of open fields to the compartmentalised one with which we are still familiar. With it came species changes of domesticated livestock and crops, which themselves signalled wider change in the farmed landscape's ecology as different patterns of selective grazing altered the composition and structure of herbage. New crop species and the technology of growing them introduced or destroyed niches occupied by specialist biota, from land snails to rodents, ground-nesting birds to fungus varieties. It was a revolution in agriculture that affected every dimension of the Scottish environment. Most discussion of this agricultural revolution is socio-economic in focus or aligned to exploration of technological developments and experimentation in farming techniques. Yet, the reconfiguration of patterns of settlement and modes of exploitation at this time, which laid the foundations of modern lowland and upland landscapes, triggered the fastest episode of anthropogenic environmental transformation experienced before the later 20th century. Improvement agriculture is usually expressed in terms of increases in the quality of arable farmland and pasture through the application of new methods of management and new, cheaply available agricultural technology like cast iron ploughshares, and the quantity or extent of ground so improved. It is viewed conventionally as enabling maximum betterment of the land's potential to support cultivation and livestock, yielding surpluses that brought profit to producers and cheaper food to consumers. Although there were areas, like Ranachmoor, for example, that were beyond the capability of would-be improvers to bring into profitable use, this period saw widespread draining of coastal and inland wetlands, breaking into at least rotational cultivation, formerly occasionally cropped outfields and pasture, alongside a new retreat from some high-altitude marginal areas. Through mineral enrichment and intensive manuring of the soil, new ploughing equipment and methods, modification to drainage, crop rotations, sowing of new cultivated plants, including the cropping of clover and new grass species, and increased use of lucerne, peas and beans as nitrogen-fixing fodder crops, and the removal of peat blankets that we saw yesterday. The spread of improved agriculture initiated an ecological sea change whose legacy surrounds us. Enclosure was a first step on this road. Few landowners had taken advantage of legislation available since 1661 that encouraged enclosure for cultivation, woodland plantation, livestock management, and realignment of land boundaries, or from 1685, division of commonties. That last process in areas where multiple landowners held shared rights of access to grazing, fuel and other organic materials with their rights exercised by their tenants is usually seen as primarily a post-1760 and mainly lowland phenomenon. Enclosure, however, was underway long before 1750 and throughout Scotland. Change was slow and dependent on the availability of the capital to fund development. Access to capital was itself linked to market conditions that enabled conversion of rents in kind into the cash to pay for not only new equipment, breeding stock, plants and seeds, but also for the costs involved in bringing about legal enclosure and then constructing enclosed fields. Capital flows increased late in the century as landowning families profited from colonial trade investments, including from plantations worked by enslaved labour, or from prize money and plunder of foreign wars, appropriating the natural capital of overseas territories to fund developments on their estates at home. None of this, however, was in any sense systematic in the earlier 1700s and proceeded piecemeal in the middle decades of the century. As Roy's maps record, the result, or at least the intention, was a patchwork of blocks of enclosure and improved farmland dispersed through a largely unimproved landscape. Regional divergences in the speed of enclosure were influenced by market opportunities to which the enclosures responded. In some areas, the long-established livestock trade to lowland towns and to England saw landowners seize opportunities to maximise profits from live cattle. In Galloway, large-scale parks, in the Scottish meaning of that word as an enclosed piece of ground, were introduced in the later 17th century and spread down to 1725 as the trade in beef cattle expanded. The trend originated in the eastern Machars of Wigtonshire, with the Dunbars of Baldoon, whose park was described in 1684 as measuring 4.5 kilometres long by 2.5 kilometres wide and containing excellent grass. The Earls of Galloway and other local landowners followed their example, and by mid-century parks were common throughout Galloway. What they enclosed might not have seen much improvement, as reflected in William Burroughs' dismissive observation, quote, that the people have a method of styling all ground enclosed parks, though perhaps some of those parks produce nothing of benefit of man or beast, end quote. Using the Enclosure Acts and associated division of commonty legislation, grazing for herds several thousand strong was created. By 1721, in the eastern Machars, Sir John Clark of Pennycook reported that 20,000 acres was cattle enclosure, to the great profit of local landowners, whom he estimated made over 10,000 guineas annually, but loss to the displaced farming population. Clark, indeed, described former arable land as laid waste. The process was often heavy-handed and insensitive, triggering an unprecedented degree of local resistance from those dispossessed or who feared dispossession, culminating in 1724 in the revolt of the Galloway Levellers. It took military intervention in 1725 to suppress the rising, but punishments were lenient, possibly because it was recognised by government that the landowners' actions had indeed been provocative. Parks of similar scale were formed at the southern end of the drove routes from the Highlands. All were private enterprises carved from demesne rather than divided commonty, but the legislation that enabled the creation of regular enclosures by exchange of property with adjoining proprietors encouraged their creation. One important investor was the Edinburgh lawyer George Smollett, younger son of the improving Baronet Sir James Smollett of Bonhill. In 1730s, George leased parks he had enclosed and seeded in the 1720s on his estate at Ingleston, west of Edinburgh, to drovers bringing stock to the city. He had invested in the grass quality of the land to be rented, buying ryegrass and clover seed in bulk to sow there. Through to the second quarter of the 19th century, such parks served as recovery grounds on which cattle driven for sale in lowland cattle markets were refattened before being brought into urban slaughterhouses. Lowland grassland at first within such cattle parks, but progressively extending over tenanted pastures, experienced profound but widely unrecognised transformation. Sowing of fodder grasses, clover, and legumes like lucerne and various pea varieties was central to improvement practices in England by the 17th century and spread into Scotland with those ideas. Research into the take-up of grass sowing is limited, focused largely on well-documented cases like John Coburn of Ormiston in the 1730s or George Dundas of Dundas in the 1740s. It suggests that rapid expansion of the practice occurred after about 1760. But trial grass sowing was current within the nationwide network of improvement-minded landowners before 1725. Smollett at Ingleston, for example, was doing so by 1723, and it is likely that his father and brother were sowing grass on the family's Dumbartonshire estates, where droving routes converged at the south end of Loch Lomond. Orders for red and white clover seed grew with the spread of improvement practice to the management of grassland, and unquestionably accelerated after 1750, with the landowners from the Hebrides and Orkney to Lothian and throughout the Highlands seeking the advertised benefits of introduced grass, clover, and legume species. Former outfield areas, previously cropped occasionally and usually after the folding of livestock there to give a nutrient boost prior to ploughing, was prime land for experimentation with grass, rapeseed, novel legumes like sainfoin and lucerne and clover. Estate and business accounts show a well-established trade in grass seed in existence by mid-century. By the 1780s, experimentation with ryegrass, the most common species used in the 18th century, and the prevalent lowland grass type today, was widespread. The Duke of Gordon purchased ryegrass in 1782 for his Speyside properties, and in the Border, the Inneses of Stow trialled various species in 1787, including red, white, and yellow clover, ribbed, and ryegrass. Gilbert Innes instructed his estate officers to try the yellow clover and ribbed grass on different parts of his land, noting that, quote, "as they are not much in use in the country, a trial of that kind will more easily ascertain their utility," end quote. Ryegrass was, by then, the tried, tested, and proven fodder grass, but improvers were keen to try new and potentially more productive varieties. Deliberate cultivation of grass, usually as an almost monospecies crop, as opposed to exploitation of the naturally occurring mixed grass and wildflower herbage, started permanent change in the composition and appearance of lowland grasslands. The creation of cultivated grassland also signalled the beginning of further widespread large-scale habitat loss. The inclusion of clover, especially the vigorous red variety, which was widely recognized as beneficial for the fertility of the underlying soils, was central in this. Wherever it was sown, its nitrogen-fixing quality, only becoming aware of that after 1830s, nitrogen-fixing quality altered soil chemistry over areas and on a scale far beyond any soil improver employed in the past. It was, however, just one tool in an improving toolkit deployed to transform agricultural productivity and whose evident utility was endorsed by satisfied experimenters. Word-of-mouth networks and eyewitness evidence from visits to trial areas ensured that the successes of new plant types and other improvement practices like liming were broadcast nationwide. Now, amongst the scientific discoveries of the 17th century was the value of liming, using pulverized burnt lime to reduce soil acidity and enhance nutrient availability to crops. Used on both regularly cropped infields and infrequently cropped outfields, it brought notable improvement in crop quality and yields and delivered a new viability to marginal areas as permanently cultivated fields. That new viability brought a dramatic increase by 1790 in the extent of land under regular, if not continuous, tillage in the lowlands especially. In 1758, Burrell had noted the nature of soil improvement practiced in districts through which he travelled and the diversity of forms that it took. Amongst these, liming dominated where materials were available. Liming practice had spread from Fife and the Lothians, where it was common by the later 1600s, into adjacent districts where transportation allowed or where limestone occurred locally. On land flanking Flanders Moss, for example, liming with material from eastern Stirlingshire is first recorded in the 1690s. Local lime sources were identified and exploited by 1707, and by the 1720s, annual liming was a standard lease condition. Although most lime produced was for constructional rather than agricultural use, accounts show that limestone was imported for agricultural lime making or searched for locally around Scotland from the earlier 1700s. On the Angus coast, limestone was quarried by the 1690s here at Bodden on the estate of the Scots of Rossay, Dunnonald and Ousson, with Patrick Scott of Rossay and his son Robert Scott of Dunnonald investing in lime for agriculture. Demand burgeoned after 1720, triggering prospection for exploitable limestone and experimentation with new kiln types for its more efficient burning. Scott of Dun-and-Ald was a leader in kiln technology in the later 1730s, and amongst the 38 queries, responses and advice notes received and given after 1723 and published in 1743 in the Transactions of the Honourable Society of Improvers in the Knowledge of Agriculture in Scotland, nice snappy title, he described the construction of new and more efficient forms of lime kilns, fired with coal, and how to best process and apply their product. 26 of the papers concerned methods of arable and grassland improvement in accordance with the Society's aim of, quote, directing the husbandry of the different soils for the most profitable purposes, end quote, with most members indicating that liming was either already practiced or soon to be introduced on their land. By the 1730s, lime was applied on acid soils all around Scotland. In 1737, the Breadalbane estate had at least 6 lime kilns, utilising outcrops that in previous centuries were quarried for building lime. One prominent Society of Improvers member with lands distant from the limestone-rich southeast was Sir Archibald Grant of Moneymusk in Aberdeenshire, who promoted its use to his tenants and neighbours. Grant made liming a requirement in his tenancy rules in the 1740s and initiated searches for outcrops to reduce the deterrent impact of transport cost to his inland properties. Alongside individual actions, however, were broader initiatives to promote lime use, most prominently from the 1750s by the Forfeited Estates Commission through its actions in respect of the annexed estates of forfeited Jacobites. Its members included influential improvers like Clark of Pennycook. The Annexed Estates Commission aimed to safeguard pacification of formerly Jacobite-supporting areas through their economic development, with agriculture regarded as a key lever for achieving that aim. At Rannoch, on the forfeited Robertson estate in West Perthshire in 1769-70, it established a water-powered limestone crushing mill, in part with an eye to continuing with fruitless efforts to improve the bogs of Rannoch Moor. By such developments, limestone quarries, crushing mills and kilns became by 1790 almost ubiquitous features of estate infrastructure across areas of mainland Scotland where stone and fuel sources were present or materials easily transportable. We can only guess at the volume of limestone quarried and spread as lime on agricultural land, and should not, therefore, underestimate the scale of the change that it had begun to work before the yet greater application of lime and other chemical agents like guano in the 19th and 20th centuries. Contemporaries might not have remarked upon changes in the flora and the biota which depended on specific plant species, as the soil pH moved from acid to alkaline, for these were disparaged as unproductive wildflowers or plants dismissed as weeds that had plagued pre-improvement agriculture. These, however, were the first unintentional casualties of the drive to escape from the millennia-old knife edge upon which Scottish subsistence agriculture long teetered. Manuring using the dung of livestock, human feces, domestic and farmyard midden and shambles waste was ancient practice. But in the 19th century, the ingredients, accumulation, storage, transport and application of manure became the almost fetishized subjects of improvement discourse. Grant of Moneymusk's farm regulations of circa 1744, for example, recommend constituents and methods for developing the best manure for different soil types, including the recycling of old farm buildings, which were primarily of turf, wattle and heather and straw thatch construction. Scotland's expanding towns were looked to by their farming neighbours as manure sources, as fewer burgesses actively cultivated their own ground and so no longer wished to conserve their midden waste as fertiliser. As early as 1715, Elgin Council required townsfolk to clear middens weekly, and the council took responsibility for clearing street dung, which was then sold on to farmers in the borough hinterland. Street cleansing and midden removal became a commercial proposition, rights being auctioned at Raup and the successful bidder organising weekly collections and then making a profit from the on-sale of the waste to farmers. Interestingly, it was mainly the borough's lawyers who got involved in that business. There was particular demand from fishing communities like Newhaven on the Forth and Greenock on the Clyde, whose processing waste was deemed especially efficacious as fertiliser. Through the dispersal of their wastes over extensive areas, Perth, for example, supplied manure within a zone radiating some 16 kilometres from the town. Urban communities were significant contributors to the spread of improvement agriculture. How significant were these developments before 1790? Although the importance of the Society of Improvers, its membership, and the propositions floated in the transactions have been questioned, what is striking is the geographical distribution of the landowners seeking advice and the diversity of the land and soil types with which they were concerned. These ranged over coastal wetland, lowland bogs, wet and dry upland areas, clay, gravel and sand, underscoring the ambitions of would-be improvers to convert low-yield and marginal land to productivity and profit. The transactions editor, Robert Maxwell of Arkland, was especially fulsome in his praises of Archibald Campbell, Earl of Islay, singling out his experimentation with mossland, which was hitherto, quote, almost everywhere in this kingdom neglected, end quote, and which Islay saw as a most suitable soil for improvement for growing everything from grain to trees. Here we see that striking disconnect between efforts to preserve moss for fuel that I discussed yesterday and the new pressure to convert it for agriculture. The selected material in the 1743 transactions reveal that all land types, from floodplain gravels and seasonal water meadows to upland moss and whin-covered moorland, were seen as ripe for arable use. From Sir George Dunbar of Mochram's inquiries about the arable potential of grassland on his Wigtonshire estates, to Lord Rollo's drainage of peat mosses in Lower Strathearn, or Lord Ray's efforts to improve the cultivable ground around his house in northwest Sutherland, the questions and the answer given show an active network that reached into every corner of mainland Scotland and which was engaged in applying experimental methods on varying scales, from single meadows or fields to whole land holdings. Although the scale of investment was limited compared with the work of improvers in the 19th century, the correspondence leaves no doubt that improvement was a nationwide endeavour before 1750. As Maxwell's praise of Islay implies, peatland was at the forefront of much improvement activity. Much of the mossland encroachment, like that at Elgin explored yesterday, was small scale and for domestic or subsistence agriculture. But proprietors of significant moss areas made substantial inroads. In Benderloch, Burrell had a detailed discussion with his host, Campbell of Airds, about improvement of peatland. There, shell sand was used to modify the peat to support good quality pasture, or, if ploughed into the moss in bulk, create rich arable. The caveat in this improvement was that the land needed first to be drained, and Burrell reported the draining of unfathomable bogs and soil modification so that in the space of 3 years it supported grain crops. Lord Rollo's drainage on his Duncrub estate in Strathearn is typical of such actions. It involved cutting ditches to enclose an area approximately 1.6 kilometres in circumference, with further channels to drain the interior. Until Rollo started his work, the moss, said to be between 2.75 and 3.7 metres deep, supplied local fuel needs, and his plan was to sell the remaining peat as fuel to defray the cost of his work. The Society's advice to Rollo was not to remove the peat, but to plough the drier and less compact upper metre or so, burn half of that to produce what was believed to be a mineral-rich ash, and then plough that into the remaining areas before sowing it with black oats or grass and clover. For the next century, across most peatland areas of Britain, this process, described as paring and burning, was the principal means of removing unwanted peat, destroying with it the surface vegetation and creating an ash that was then ploughed into the subsoil peat as fertiliser. Far larger mossland transformations than those undertaken by Rollo were the ambition of the Society's leading members, who saw such land as representative of Scotland's moral, social and cultural backwardness. Unlocking the arable potential of the soil beneath the peat, and indeed of the peat itself, was seen as affording opportunity to transform the economic condition of the nation. By expanding cultivation, they believed that they could end the threat of general failure of cereal crops, such as was experienced as recently as 1740. The grandest scheme proposed, but thankfully only ever partly implemented, was the draining of Locher Moss in southwestern Dumfriesshire, where the peat was recognised as an infilling of a former arm of the sea, and where it was believed that fertile marine sediments were locked beneath the mossy overburden. The Society hoped that work here would be led by the largest proprietor, the Duke of Queensberry. It was instead smaller proprietors acting as resources allowed who undertook drainage piecemeal across the next century. Such incremental erosion of wetland was also what occurred on the mosses flanking the Forth west of Stirling. There, however, the process was on an altogether different level, and contrary to popular traditions of clearance operations started by Lord Kames in 1766, also built on smaller scale operations that commenced long before 1700. We can celebrate or deplore the transformation that drainage schemes on this scale represent and endlessly debate when such improvement practices commenced. But that serves little purpose in an exploration of the environmental context of improvement more generally. What matters more is that the actions wrapped inside the term were key change agents in the environmental transformation of the latter stages of the Little Ice Age. Compartmentalization into temporarily defined and artificially labelled periods only obscures the longer run of trends that created the circumstances for change and the playing out of the consequences that were unleashed. Traditionally, the transformative dimensions of improvement are discussed in social and economic terms, as I've said, and explored through the physical reconfiguration of patterns of settlement and land use. But the debates surrounding the legacies of improvement can also be usefully informed by more recent recognition of the deeper and not simply negative environmental effects wrought by the ambitions of the nation's improvers to secure their own financial position and deliver wider social, economic and cultural betterment to the Scottish people. That framing of perspectives is much needed. For we are burdened with the legacy of mid-20th century historical ecologists who traced the roots of large-scale environmental degradation to what they projected as the baleful impact of improvement philosophies and the spread of commercialism. Despite decades of more recent research that has challenged that view, the negative framing of the age of improvement maintains a tenacious grip. What is most striking in many explorations of the improvement era is how little consideration is given to the effects, positive and negative, of the practices being introduced. Couched in the language of progress and cultural advancement, it is viewed through a Whiggish lens of positive social development. That development came at great cost in environmental terms, but also with significant benefits to some plant or animal communities. It is important that we do not lose sight of the balance of those positives and negatives in present movement towards reversal of centuries of human influence in shaping the land and environment in which we live, supplanting one form of improvement with another that is more in tune with current concerns. Perhaps yet more importantly, as some of the material explored in these lectures has illustrated, while improvement most certainly entailed disjunction, discontinuity, and dislocation, it could also see continuity of long-established practice and even acceleration of trends that are visible from centuries earlier. Where the focus of research future should fall is not so much on the process and the why behind these instances of continuity or change, but on how it was achieved, and not just on the direct impacts, but on the manifold ramifications across ecosystems that resulted. Failure to do so risks another episode of well-intentioned, scientifically rational, but potentially irretrievable human and irreversible human manipulation of our environment. Thank you.